You may believe that individuation begins when you finally understand yourself. It does not. Understanding can become another hiding place, another polished room where you explain your wounds without allowing them to change the life built around them. You can know every pattern, name every archetype, recognize every projection, and still remain obedient to the same frightened identity. Knowledge alone does not cross the threshold. The threshold is crossed when your old way of being can no longer organize your life. Something deeper begins to interrupt the performance. You stop receiving the same rewards from approval. You stop believing every emotion deserves obedience. You stop calling self-betrayal kindness. You stop confusing loneliness with failure. These shifts rarely feel enlightened. They often feel like loss, disorientation, and a quiet estrangement from the person you once worked so hard to become. Carl Jung spent decades studying this exact rupture. He saw individuation not as self-improvement, but as the painful movement from a borrowed identity toward a more complete relationship with the psyche. It is not the construction of a superior personality. It is the collapse of the inner dictatorship that allowed one acceptable version of you to speak for the whole. When that dictatorship weakens, 4 unmistakable changes begin to appear. True individuation begins when the center of authority moves inward, but that sentence is easier to admire than to live. For most of your life, authority has been distributed among parents, partners, institutions, ideals, fears, and imagined audiences. Even when you rebelled, you may still have been controlled by what you opposed. Your decisions remained reactions. Your identity remained dependent on an external reference point. Jung called the socially adapted identity the persona. The persona is not false in itself. You need it to work, relate, cooperate, and belong. The problem begins when the mask becomes the only face you are permitted to recognize. Then every choice is filtered through a hidden question. Which version of you will remain acceptable here? The answer shapes your tone, your posture, your ambitions, even the truths you allow yourself to notice. A person sits in a parked car outside a family dinner. Their hand rests on the door handle, but they do not move. A message glows on the phone, asking whether they are coming inside. They type, delete, and type again before finally writing that they feel unwell. What they cannot yet say is that every visit requires them to become smaller. This is why individuation often first appears as refusal. Not dramatic refusal, not a declaration designed to be witnessed. It begins as the quiet inability to continue participating in your own disappearance. The psyche withdraws energy from roles that once secured belonging, but now demand too much unconscious sacrifice. You may call this selfishness because the people around you benefited from your previous arrangement. You may call it confusion because the old explanations no longer calm you. You may call it ingratitude because you still love those whose expectations you can no longer carry. But what you are experiencing is not a loss of character. It is the beginning of psychological differentiation. You stop needing every important person to understand your choices. This is one of the clearest signs that you have crossed into true individuation. Your life no longer waits for unanimous permission. You still care about the people you love. You still listen. You still question yourself. But you no longer treat another person's discomfort as final proof that you are wrong. Jung understood that the psyche cannot become whole while its center remains hostage to collective approval. The collective tells you what is normal, desirable, respectable, and safe. Some of that guidance is necessary. Some of it protects life. But some of it protects repetition. It keeps inherited fear alive by giving it the language of duty. The movement inward does not make you immune to influence. It makes you conscious of influence. You begin to notice when advice is actually anxiety, wearing a reasonable expression. You hear the difference between concern and control. You recognize when someone is not asking whether your choice is true, but whether your choice threatens the role they assigned you. A woman tells her closest friend that she has declined a promotion. The friend stares at her, then begins listing everything she is giving up. The woman feels the old reflex rise in her throat, the urge to justify every detail and make the decision sound respectable. Instead, she folds the paper napkin beside her cup and says, quietly, "I know what it costs." She does not explain the months of waking with dread, or the way her body tightened every Sunday evening. Jung described individuation as a separation from unconscious identification with the group. This does not mean social isolation. It means that belonging is no longer purchased through the abandonment of inner truth. You can remain connected without surrendering authorship. You can disappoint someone without turning that disappointment into a verdict on your worth. This shift is difficult because your nervous system may still interpret disapproval as danger. The adult mind knows that disagreement can be survived. The older emotional system remembers that love once depended on adaptation. When someone withdraws warmth, becomes cold, or accuses you of changing, the body may react as though exile is imminent. Individuation does not erase that reaction. It changes who makes the final decision. You begin to endure the space between being misunderstood and being proven right. You stop rushing to produce evidence. You stop turning every private choice into a courtroom defense. You allow other people to hold incomplete versions of you because correcting every misunderstanding would require returning to the old performance. The threshold appears when you can feel the pull to seek approval and still refuse to betray what you know. The discomfort remains, but obedience is no longer automatic. You begin to discover that guilt is not always a moral signal. Sometimes guilt is simply the emotional residue of leaving a role. What you are calling selfishness may be the first honest boundary your personality has ever allowed. That inner authority leads to a second change. You become less interested in protecting a flattering image of yourself. Before individuation, the ego survives through selective vision. It collects evidence that supports the preferred identity and pushes contradictory material into shadow. You may need to see yourself as generous, rational, loyal, spiritual, independent, calm, or strong. The identity itself may contain truth. The danger lies in requiring it to remain uncontested. Jung used the word shadow for the traits, impulses, needs, and capacities the conscious personality refuses to recognize as its own. The shadow is not merely cruelty, envy, greed, or rage. It also contains tenderness that once felt unsafe, ambition that was punished, sensuality that was shamed, grief that had no witness, and creative power that threatened the family order. Whatever could not be included in your acceptable self was forced to live outside the official story. When the threshold into individuation is crossed, you stop asking only, "Who am I?" You begin asking, "What have I refused to be?" That question is more dangerous because it does not flatter you. It reveals the hidden bargain beneath the personality. A man is known for being endlessly patient. At work, he smiles while colleagues interrupt him. At home, he says it is fine when plans change without asking him. One evening, he slams a cupboard after everyone has gone to bed, then stands in the dark kitchen staring at his own hand. For the first time, he does not blame the anger on stress. He wonders what the anger has been protecting. Jung did not believe wholeness came from identifying only with goodness. He saw moral development as the difficult capacity to hold tension between opposites. without becoming possessed by either side. Your anger is not automatically wisdom. Your envy is not automatically instruction. Your desire is not automatically destiny, but each one contains information about the parts of life your conscious attitude has neglected. You begin to notice projection more quickly. The person you cannot stop condemning may carry a trait you disowned. The person you idealize may embody a life you secretly want. The weakness you attack in others may resemble a need you learn to despise in yourself. Projection turns inner material into outer certainty. It allows you to encounter your own psyche while believing you are only observing someone else. Crossing the threshold does not mean you stop projecting. It means projection becomes less comfortable. Something in you interrupts the certainty. You hear your own intensity and become curious about it. You ask why this person has acquired so much psychological power. You begin to suspect that the emotional charge belongs partly to you. A woman watches a colleague speak confidently in a meeting and immediately decides the colleague is arrogant. She repeats the judgment to herself on the train home. Later, while brushing her teeth, she remembers how often she softens her own voice before offering an idea. The next morning, she opens a notebook and writes one sentence she has avoided. I resent her for using a freedom I deny myself. That sentence is a threshold, not because every judgment is secretly envy, but because she has become willing to include herself in the psychological equation. The ego no longer stands outside the problem as innocent observer. It accepts that the world it experiences is partly shaped by what it cannot yet admit. This is where many people retreat. They prefer the excitement of awakening to the humiliation of self-recognition. They want expanded consciousness without moral complication. They want to discover hidden gifts, but not hidden motives. Yet individuation requires both. The gold and the refuse are often buried in the same ground. You become able to say, "This is also mine," without collapsing into shame. That sentence is different from self-accusation. Shame says the shadow proves you are unworthy. Integration says the shadow proves you are larger than the identity you defended. One imprisons, the other creates responsibility. You no longer need to appear harmless in order to believe you are good. You can acknowledge aggression and choose not to weaponize it. You can admit hunger for recognition and refuse to manipulate for applause. You can feel jealousy without converting it into sabotage. You can recognize the desire to control and decide to tolerate uncertainty instead. What you are calling darkness may be the unlived force that your goodness was built to contain. As the shadow becomes more conscious, a third sign emerges. You stop treating inner conflict as evidence that something has gone wrong. The unindividuated ego wants consistency. It wants one clean motive, one correct path, one stable identity. It experiences contradiction as failure. If you love someone and need distance, one feeling must be false. If you feel grateful and resentful, one emotion must be shameful. If you want safety and freedom, one desire must be immature. The ego tries to solve the tension by choosing the identity it already knows. Jung saw psychological development differently. He believed transformation often begins when the conscious attitude reaches a limit and the opposite demand rises from the unconscious. The psyche creates tension because the old one-sided position can no longer carry the whole life. The conflict is not an obstacle on the path. It is the place where a new center may form. You begin to understand that maturity is not the elimination of contradiction. It is the capacity to remain present while opposing truths reorganize you. This patience is not passive. It requires more strength than premature certainty, because certainty often protects you from change. A person stands in a quiet apartment holding a packed suitcase. They have wanted to leave the relationship for months, yet their hand trembles when they touch the zipper. They sit on the edge of the bed and listen to the other person moving in the next room. Love is still present. So is the knowledge that staying has become a form of self-abandonment. The old mind demands a simple story. It wants the other person to become cruel enough to make departure easy. It wants love to vanish before a boundary is allowed. It wants pain to certify the decision. But individuation may require you to act without that simplification. You may need to leave someone you still love. You may need to remain while an old fantasy dies. You may need to grieve a choice that is still correct. Jung used the term transcendent function for the symbolic and psychological process through which a new position emerges from sustained tension between conscious and unconscious demands. The word transcendent does not mean magical escape. It means that the psyche may produce a third possibility that could not be reached by forcing either side to win too quickly. You may ask whether to remain successful or abandon everything, then discover the deeper issue is your addiction to proving worth through exhaustion. You may ask whether to forgive or cut someone off, then realize you have never learned to set a boundary without hatred. You may ask which version of yourself is real, then discover both were adaptations around a deeper need. A man receives an invitation to return to the career he once left. He opens the email 3 times during the day. Pride says accepting would prove he was never a failure. Fear says refusing would waste his talent. That night, he notices neither voice has asked whether the work still has meaning. The threshold is crossed when you stop demanding immediate relief from uncertainty. You become willing to let the question mature. This does not mean endless indecision. It means you no longer mistake urgency for truth. Some decisions require action quickly, but many internal crises become destructive only because you insist on resolving them before the deeper material has spoken. The psyche has its own tempo. The ego hates this because waiting weakens its illusion of control. Yet true individuation develops through an intimacy with timing. You learn when an answer is absent because you are avoiding it, and when an answer is absent because it has not yet formed. You also become less frightened by regression. Old fears return, old dreams repeat. A behavior you believed finished appears again under pressure. Before, you may have treated this as proof that nothing changed. Now you see that the psyche often revisits an old wound from a new level of consciousness. Repetition can be failure, but it can also be deepening. You notice the difference in how you meet the pattern. Perhaps you still seek reassurance, but you recognize the impulse before acting. Perhaps anger still rises, but you can feel grief beneath it. Perhaps you still withdraw, but you no longer construct a philosophy to justify disappearance. The symptom may resemble the past, while your relationship to it has changed. What you are calling confusion may be the mind learning to survive without a false answer. From that capacity to hold tension comes the 4th sign. Your life becomes less impressive to the persona and more meaningful to the soul. This shift can be difficult to explain because the outer changes may look like decline. You may lose interest in goals that once gave you status. You may withdraw energy from relationships built on performance. You may become quieter, slower, and more selective. People who understood your ambition may not understand your restraint. People who admired your usefulness may become uneasy when you stop being endlessly available. Jung saw individuation as a movement toward the self, the organizing totality of the psyche that is larger than the conscious ego. The self is not your preferred identity, your personal brand, or the ideal version of you. It is the deeper center that seeks a life capable of including what you actually are. When the ego begins to relate to that center, success is measured differently. You begin asking whether a choice creates inner coherence, not whether it creates admiration. You notice which achievements leave you internally divided. You notice which ordinary acts restore a sense of participation in your own life. A conversation without performance may matter more than a room full of praise. An afternoon of concentrated work may feel more real than public recognition. A small home that allows you to breathe may become more desirable than a prestigious life that requires constant self-estrangement. A woman once posted every milestone the moment it happened. She watched the reactions arrive and felt briefly solid. Months later, she finishes a piece of work that took years, then closes the laptop without telling anyone. She makes tea, stands by the window, and feels something quieter than pride. Nothing has been displayed, yet the achievement belongs to her more completely than anything before. This does not make ambition impure. Individuation does not require poverty, obscurity, or withdrawal from the world. Jung did not ask you to destroy the persona, only to place it in proper relationship to the whole. You can lead, create, earn, build, and become visible. The question is whether your outer life expresses the psyche or compensates for its neglect. When outer success functions as compensation, it must be repeated constantly because it never reaches the wound. Recognition fades. Achievement becomes baseline. The next goal appears before the current one can be felt. You remain productive, but nothing is metabolized. The personality becomes a machine for generating proof. Crossing the threshold changes the emotional economy. You still enjoy appreciation, but you are less dependent on it for existence. You can produce something valuable without making it carry your entire worth. You can rest without immediately converting rest into guilt. You can choose a smaller life in one area, so that a deeper life can emerge in another. This often creates a period of invisibility. The old identity has lost authority, but the new form is not yet socially legible. You may feel less certain, less driven, and less recognizable. Others may assume you have lost your edge. In reality, energy is being withdrawn from adaptation and gathered for a more authentic direction. A man leaves a crowded professional event earlier than planned. In the elevator, he removes the name badge and slips it into his pocket. He walks home instead of calling a car, passing lit restaurants and groups of people leaning toward one another. He feels no dramatic revelation. He simply realizes he no longer wants to spend his life being introduced. The soul's meaning is often quiet. It does not always produce the emotional intensity you associate with purpose. It may appear as steadiness, a reduced need to explain, a deeper capacity for attention. You stop chasing experiences that confirm you are alive, because ordinary life begins to feel inhabited again. You may become more devoted to craft than image, to relationship than role, to rhythm than acceleration. You begin to protect what cannot survive constant exposure, not from fear, but from reverence. Some parts of the psyche need privacy to develop. Seeds do not become stronger because they are dug up each morning and shown to an audience. What you are calling loss of ambition may be the end of using achievement to negotiate for the right to exist. These 4 signs do not arrive neatly. They overlap, disappear, return, and deepen. You may hold inner authority in one part of life and remain dependent in another. You may integrate a shadow trait, then discover a subtler form beneath it. You may tolerate uncertainty until one particular wound is touched. You may choose meaning over image, then find yourself secretly hoping the choice will still be admired. Individuation is not a permanent state of psychological clarity. It is a relationship to unconsciousness. The threshold is crossed when you can no longer fully believe the old arrangement. Even when you temporarily return to it, you may still perform, appease, project, rush, and seek proof. But something has seen through the mechanism. The old innocence is gone. That loss of innocence carries a deeper cost than most descriptions of individuation admit. Once you begin to hear your own psyche, you become responsible for what you know. You can no longer blame the role entirely if you continue choosing it consciously. You can no longer call every sacrifice love when you know fear is underneath. You can no longer condemn another person for carrying the life you refuse to claim. Awareness does not remove constraint, but it changes your relationship to complicity. This is the shadow beneath the shadow. You may discover that part of you prefers the prison because the prison provides an identity. The role that exhausts you may also protect you from risk. The relationship that diminishes you may also save you from solitude. The family script that confines you may also excuse you from becoming responsible for a life no one else can authorize. A person complains for years about being overlooked. Then an opportunity arrives that would require them to speak publicly and accept visible responsibility. They leave the message unanswered for 3 days. Each time the phone lights up, they feel irritation toward the sender. Beneath the irritation is the terror that being seen would remove the comfort of imagining what they might have become. This is where individuation stops feeling like liberation and begins feeling like sacrifice. You may have to give up the identity of the misunderstood one. You may have to release the moral superiority of always being the giver. You may have to surrender the fantasy that someone will finally notice your pain and repay every unspoken compromise. The psyche may ask for a choice that costs belonging, certainty, status, or innocence. Not because suffering is noble, but because every real form excludes another form. To choose one life is to grieve the lives that choice makes impossible. The unindividuated personality avoids this grief by remaining divided. It keeps every door psychologically open and enters none completely. Jung understood that becoming whole includes tragedy because consciousness reveals limits. You cannot be every possibility. You cannot preserve every bond. You cannot remain innocent of your choices. The fantasy of total fulfillment must die so that a particular life can be lived. This may be the choice you are still avoiding, not whether you know yourself, but whether you will bear the consequences of what you know. Insight without consequence becomes decoration. It allows the ego to feel deep while the life remains unchanged. You do not need to force a dramatic rupture to prove that individuation is happening. You do not need to abandon everyone, rename yourself, or turn your pain into a public identity. The psyche is not asking for theater. It is asking for relationship. You are allowed to stop proving that your boundary is reasonable enough to be respected. You are allowed to stop presenting your shadow as a defect that must be removed before you deserve love. You are allowed to stop rushing conflict toward a clean answer. You are allowed to stop measuring the worth of your life by how impressive it appears from outside. You are also allowed to move slowly where the cost is real. Inner authority is not impulsiveness. Shadow integration is not acting out every feeling. Tolerating tension is not refusing to decide forever. Choosing meaning is not rejecting material life. Individuation does not free you from responsibility. It makes responsibility more intimate. The person you were before the threshold was not foolish. That person learned how to survive through adaptation. The persona protected belonging. Repression protected you from conflicts you were not ready to hold. Certainty protected you from psychic overwhelm. Achievement may have carried you through years when stillness would have exposed too much pain. You do not need to hate that former self. Hatred would only create another split. You can recognize the intelligence of the adaptation while refusing to let it govern the future. Gratitude does not require continued obedience. The accusation at the beginning was that understanding yourself might be another hiding place. From the other side, the truth is quieter. Understanding becomes real when it changes what you are willing to betray. You have crossed the threshold, not when you can describe individuation, but when the old self-betrayal begins to feel more dangerous than the uncertainty of becoming. True individuation does not make you certain of who you are. It makes you less willing to live as who you are not. The threshold is crossed when your life begins to answer to the whole psyche, even before the new path has a name. If this resonates, subscribe to The Waking Shadow, where you explore Jung's psychology for those walking the individuation path. Watch the video on your screen now for the next stage of becoming who your life has been asking you to become.